So let's talk a little bit about specific things about Jungian psychology. First off, this is the sort of the structural model of Jungian psychology. You'll notice here that it is very similar to Freud. You've got an ego, you've got structures of the ego, you've got things that are similar to the superego. You have a personal unconscious, that things get repressed into it by the ego. Jung did not disagree with Freud about that. Okay? Jung came up with the idea, even while he was with Freud, that stuff from the unconscious gets combined with things that are repressed, and you can form things that he coined the word complexes. So you might say someone has an Oedipal complex, right? A complex of things mixed together. Jung later adds on this other layer of the unconscious called the collective unconscious. And in your reading, remember I asked you guys to read that reading on the 2 essays, and in that work, Jung really talks about the personal and the collective unconscious in that. Okay? And this collective unconscious is the shared stuff that we have as human beings. Now, Jung, I'll talk about this a little more in a minute. Jung has some different conceptions of this, and he speaks out of both sides of his mouth simultaneously. We'll talk a little bit about that. Not necessarily mutually exclusive, but different ways of thinking of this collective unconscious. So, let's talk first about the ego. Freud's view of the ego is pretty similar to what Jung thinks about the ego. The ego is a focal point of consciousness, the bearer of identity, organizer of thoughts and intuitions, gatekeeper between basically inner and outer worlds, between unconscious and conscious mind. This is pretty much the way Freud views the ego. Okay? The reason that you stopped at the stop sign, on their way into campus driving in today, your ego there was working unconsciously. But it could have also worked consciously. You could have looked at that stop sign and said, oh, I got to stop now. Or maybe there was a new stop sign. Oh, I haven't seen that one before. I better stop, right? So the ego partly is conscious, partly unconscious. Same for Freud and same for Jung. No difference there. What Jung adds to the ego functions is essentially a layer of coloration. In other words, Jung talks about the ego having different ways of perceiving. And it's almost like if you put on a pair of yellow sunglasses, everything would look kind of yellow to you. You put on a pair of rose-colored glasses, everything looks kind of rosy, right? This is the same idea that Jung has about the ego, that people's egos have different ways of perceiving and responding to the world. And Jung had four ego type functions: intuition, sensation, feeling, and thinking, and these are along these continuums. So you're either more one or the other. You're more intuitive, you're more sensate, you're more feeling, you're more thinking. Okay? And I didn't put the feeling function down here. I'll talk about that in a second. Thinking function is analytic, rational way of perceiving the world. The feeling function is you basically perceive the world through what feels good and what doesn't feel good, how it feels to you, as opposed to through a logical process. Sensation function orientation is the outward physical reality. Intuition function orientation is the inward psychic reality. Okay? Now, we can talk about this. This guy you probably don't recognize because he's the old Spock. I should have put the new Spock up. But the new Spock is not quite as rational as the old one, so I put this one up. But this is the character from Star Trek, named after me. No, not really. Actually, probably, I don't know. He's a Vulcan, comes from the planet Vulcan, right? And this is a planet of beings that, humanoid beings that were very, very warlike and very aggressive and very emotional in the past and almost destroyed their society, so they had to develop a system of logic and a system to repress their emotions and just use logical, rational thought to make decisions about everything, right? And so dominated by a thinking function. And so you can think of people like this. Right, they're dominated by their thinking function. They often appear detached and unemotional. Right? Can you think of anybody like this? You might know. If you know scientists, sometimes scientists are a little bit like this. Right? They don't let their feelings get in the way of the logic they're doing. Of course, what happens is it becomes a problem when this logical person uses their thinking function, their rational function, to negotiate emotional or romantic situations. Right, so this is the episode where Spock gets hit by these spores, and then he can now express his emotions to his old girlfriends, and as you imagine, doesn't turn out well. I'm showing you these pictures also partly to encourage you to watch the original series of Star Trek. It's really the best one. Okay? Just saying. Okay? But I actually have I put some other lecture slides. I have some updated slides here, and I might, instead of having Spock here, I might have Benjamin Cumberbatch and playing Sherlock. He's a good example of also a thinking character. Right? You guys may be, more relate to that more. But you can think of characters like this, right? Yeah. So Oprah's a better idea of a feeling function. But this is also from Star Trek. This is Counselor Troy, and she's the ship's counselor, and she's an empath and a telepath, and she can sense what people are, how they're feeling. And this is the way a feeling function person perceives the world. An empathetic, value-based, emotional way of perceiving, accepts or rejects idea based on whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. Okay? Now, thinking and feeling are both rational processes, by the way. In the sense that they're rational in the sense that they require a judgment, make a decision about something. It's just that the thinking person does it through logic, and the feeling person does it through what feels good, through his feeling. Okay? Okay. God, you guys, I'm sorry, you got the full-on Star Trek lecture. I have different versions of the slideshow, and so you got the Star Trek one. I'm sorry. It must have just been unconscious parapraxis somehow that I wanted just to show you Star Trek. I've been watching a lot of Star Trek the past couple of months. Sensation function. This refers to conscious perception through the sense organs. The sensation personality type relates to physical stimuli. So this is a person who they have to feel, touch, lick, smell, get hit by, get run over by something out in the physical world in order for something to be real. Okay? And I use this example of Worf. He's the Klingon in the Star Trek thing, and Worf is the kind of guy, if he's not actually out there fighting it, it doesn't really exist, right? That's why I put him there. By the way, he's the celebrity endorsement for my book. I got a picture of him reading my book for my thing. Unfortunately, not in full makeup, which was too bad. Michael Dorn, by the way. Very good actor. Now the intuition function is like sensation in that it's an experience which is immediately given to consciousness, but where sensation function is given to consciousness through the sense organs, intuition is something that's given to consciousness through mental activity, either thinking or feeling. Okay? And it comes unconscious. It has no physical cause. It's more like a hunch or a feeling or an ESP experience. And it's related to inspiration, creativity, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So sensation comes from the world, from something physical in the world impinging upon your senses, and intuition is something that comes from inside, just from your own mental processes. Okay? And sensation and intuition are both irrational. They involve no reason, but simply result from stimuli. You don't make a judgment, you're just experiencing it. And the stimuli can be either internal or external. Okay? And I put the picture of Captain Kirk, the original Captain Kirk, up here because this is what he was known for, is making decisions based on his intuition. Sometimes it would be better, the decisions would be better than just being made from pure logic. Spock would say to do one thing, and Kirk would say, no, we got to do it like this because I just have a hunch that this is how it's going to turn out. Okay, so he was, and of course, he's the best Star Trek captain. I'm going to brainwash you guys now. He's the best one. The new Captain Kirk, Christopher Pine, pretty good. He's pretty good. I like the new ones quite a bit as well. But he's the original, and he's known for his intuitive leadership. Okay, so these are Jung's ideas about ego functions. A mother-daughter team, Myers and Briggs, got together and decided to make a testing instrument, a personality test out of this, and they came up with the Myers-Briggs type inventory, which has introversion. They also added to this something else Jung talked about, introvert and extrovert, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Then they have sensation, intuitive, thinking, feeling, and then they have, remember we talked about judging and perceiving, right? So that, thinking and feeling is more about judging, and perceiving is more about sensing and intuitive. So they added a fourth category here based on these two. And you might argue this one Is this really necessary because we have these two? But they put that in there, okay? And then they had introvert and extrovert. Now, introverts and extroverts are very interesting. Jung talked about this. He was definitely an introvert. It's not what you typically think what introversion and extroversion are, okay? Introverts are people that it really has to do where you get your energy from. So if you're an introverted person, you basically get your energy by doing things on your own, being by yourself. And if you're an extrovert, you get energy by basically going out and interacting with other people. Okay? And so this is very interesting. People don't really get this. They think this has to do with it. So I'll give you a good example of myself. I am an extreme introvert. When I take the Myers-Briggs, or any version of it, every time I've taken it, I score, way over on the introverted side of things. I'm a very, very introverted person. Okay? And had my own druthers, I'd be in a black room playing goth music, with foil on the windows, burning black candles, sitting there, just in my puddle of my own emotions, right? But I don't do that. Instead, what I do for a living is I get up in front of groups of people and talk. And when I'm not doing this in front of you guys, getting up and talking to students, I'm a musician and I go out and I play in front of crowds of people. Those seem like very extroverted things, right? They're not. You can be an introvert and do those things, okay? And I enjoy doing this. In fact, if I don't get a chance to lecture to you guys, I start having withdrawal symptoms. I'll go up to people on the street and say, I got to tell you about Jung, Here, sit down. Let me just give you a lecture about Jung, right? So, I love doing these things. I love talking to people. I love getting up in front of people. I like being on TV. I've been on TV and radio. I love doing that stuff. But I'm really introverted. What it means is when I'm done doing this stuff, I'm done doing this extroverted thing that I do, I got to go home and I got to be by myself. I got to spend a few hours recharging my batteries. That means no kids, no wife, sitting around by myself, probably watching Star Trek, just being by myself. That's how I recharge my batteries. And the same for an extroverted person. An extroverted person might be somebody who sits in a cubicle all day and does statistical analysis by themselves. But when they get off work, they're just exhausted. So what do they want to do? They want to go out to a party, they want to go out to a bar, they want to hang out with other people. And what you'll find is, very interestingly enough, a lot of times couples you'll find opposites in couples. My wife is extremely extroverted. And this is always a point of contention. I get home from the day I've been talking to you guys all day. I get home, I just want to zone out. I don't want to see more people than I have to interact with. She gets home from work. She's a lawyer. She's been writing legal briefs all day by herself in her office. She wants to go out and party, right? So in couples, this is often a point of contention that couples will have. Trying to figure out, sometimes I got to go to the party with her, and sometimes she's got to sit at home with me, right? You got to make compromises about this stuff. Okay? Very interesting. So if you do couples therapy, this actually can be a very useful instrument. Also very useful in work situations, in work settings, because I used to go out and do organizational consulting, and I would give this to people at work. And I had one company I went in and consulted with, where the management was having a really hard time talking to the engineers and the programmers. They just couldn't communicate. So I gave them all the Myers-Briggs, and sure enough, all the engineer programmer types were introverted, thinking types, and all the managers were extroverted feeling types. And so they didn't get along. And so what I had to do is basically bring them in a room and talk about how you communicate with somebody who's different than you, right? And so this is a very useful tool for organizational consulting. Okay? Clinical psychology, if you're Jungian, you might use it. Other clinical psychologists will not use this. They'll not use it clinically. Because again, if you're going to use it clinically, you've almost got to be kind of functioning from a Jungian point of view. Okay. Let's see. So there's 16 Myers-Briggs types, and you can read about all these on your own. I won't go into these. The actual Myers-Briggs test is very long, but you can go online. There's a couple of versions online, shorter ones. And I have found in my experience of teaching this class and taking these tests over the past 20 years that the shorter ones seem to be just as accurate, at least for me, as the longer ones. I think the shorter ones are pretty good. So you can take one of the shorter ones and you'll figure out your type here, and you can talk about this. Okay. Now, extroverts make up about 75% of the population. Introverts about 25%. So introverts are a much smaller group, and I've often said to people, being an introvert, especially in our society, especially in Southern California, being introvert is pretty much, what it must be like if somebody's left-handed, because the world is designed and functions in an extroverted way for the most part, and you are at some disadvantage if you're an introvert. It's very interesting. Like we do the way we do interviews in this university, where we have every candidate come here must be involved in a group process. I don't know, maybe some of you guys have observed some of those, because we like to have students come and comment on those. Those are group exercises that highly favor extroverts. And I've actually mentioned this a couple times to people. I said, you can't judge somebody. Somebody may be introverted who's not going to do well in this. And one of the value systems of this university is that people have to do well in this extroverted process. So if we have a candidate come in and they're really introverted, I might pull them aside and say, you're going to have to, as Jung would say, develop your inferior function and be able to behave as an extrovert, at least for a little while, because the job interview is going to favor extroverts. And so there's a lot of things in our society that are like this. Extroversion tends to be favored. Now, if you're among psychology students, what I've found over the years is that psychology majors, the blend between introversion and extroversion tends to be a little more equal. We have a lot more introverts becoming psychologists. That kind of makes sense, right? Introverts kind of want to figure themselves out. They want to figure out other people. That's kind of an introverted activity. So we have a lot more introverts represented in the psychology major, at least in my experience. We could have you guys all take the test, and we could see if, again, you don't have to report your results on any of these tests, but if you feel like it, we can take a poll and see how many. Everybody here know their Myers-Briggs type? Yeah? Some of you don't. You can go take the test. I can put a link up. Yes?
I took the link.
Yeah.
And it comes out different every time because a lot of the questions I'm not decided on.
You have to decide the first thing that comes to your mind. You cannot sit there and ponder over the questions. You got to do the first thing that comes to your mind. You got to actually go through, empty your mind, go through, and as you do, just your first impression, very quick. Don't sit there and ponder over it. And that should give you a stable result. I've been taking this for 20 years. My judging and perceiving are really almost equal, so I flip between those, between P and J at the end, but everything else has been stable for the last 20 years. On all these tests, the online ones and the real one, all of them. So, but you can't sit there and think about it. You have to do your immediate, whenever your immediate thing comes to mind. Okay? So you have to turn off your thinking mind and just whatever's immediate, right? Okay? So yeah, so I'd be curious to know how many are introverted, how many are extroverted, but you don't have to raise your hand. This is, how many, if you feel like it, how many people are introverts? Yeah, so that's, the psychology major, we're way overrepresented. So as psychologists, I would tell you if you're extroverted, maybe there's a certain kind of psychology, maybe if you're going to be a clinician, it would be better for you to practice. If you're introvert, Jung and Freud will be your friends. This kind of psychology practice very good for introverts, right? Not that you can't. Freud was probably an extrovert, by the way. He was pretty extroverted. He liked hanging around people. He'd go and do his thing, and then he would go on walks with people. He had correspondence. He did a lot of extroverted things. And Jung was really an introvert. Jung was an INFP, introverted, intuitive person. And again, I said that here. So let's talk a little bit about the Jungian structural model. Jung's idea of the personal unconscious, similar to Freud, we already said this. Jung places complexes within the personal unconscious, but for Jung, he adds this idea that stuff from the collective unconscious gets bound up into the personal unconscious, and they get sort of knotted together. So the stuff you repressed gets knotted together, the stuff coming up from the collective unconscious, and that forms this complex, which then exerts an effect over your conscious life. Okay.
Can you explain that again?
Yeah, so stuff from your personal unconscious that you repress. Okay, so let's say in a real Freudian way, let's say you have sexual desire toward, let's say you have a sexual desire toward your father, very Oedipal kind of situation, right? That's unacceptable to your conscious mind, so you repress it into your personal unconscious, right? But then what happens is, from Jung's point of view, stuff comes from the collective unconscious. And what comes from the collective unconscious might be, a father figure, father image. That, everybody in this room has a father. Everybody here has had a biological father. Whether you ever knew your father or not, you had a biological father. Every ancestor that you ever had a biological father. Every animal that reproduces sexually has a biological father. So there's this deep, deep well of unconscious knowledge about fathers and interacting with fathers and behaving around fathers and behaving like a father that we all share because we're human beings and we have the same common ancestry. And so that stuff, that knowledge about fathers gets mixed up with the father stuff that you repressed. They get bound together. And that binding together of these things is what Jung thought of as the complex. That complex can then exert a force in your conscious life. And it may just take the form of an Oedipal complex, right? Where, you have some interaction with your father in some way, blah, blah, blah. It may affect it that way. But it has this element of it that includes the collective unconscious that Freud did not have. Okay? Freud, you just repress it from conscious. It tries to get back into the conscious mind, and that's it. Jung, there's more things involved. Okay? There's more stuff involved. Now, Jung called stuff that comes from the collective unconscious, he called it archetypes. And archetypes are essentially images. And archetypes can be thought of as models which other things are patterned after. And this is a very interesting statement, and really we can trace this idea back to Plato. Plato had ideas about archetypes, and that these are patterns. And for Plato, archetypes were perfect patterns. They were the perfect representation of something. Everything in our reality is an imitation of that, a copy. In other words, let me give you an example. Look at this chair. Okay, here's a chair right here. Okay, here's a chair. You're all sitting in these. Okay, you know this is a chair. You know this chair because it has a certain form, a certain pattern to it that you recognize as a chair, right? This is something that you sit on. Well, here's another chair. This one's different. It's different. But you also recognize that this is a chair. Okay? It has that same quality to it of chairness, right? Now, I could have another thing here. I don't have it here, but I could have like a stool, like a bar stool. You would recognize that also as a chair. I could have a Barca lounger, which reclines and vibrates. You would recognize that as a chair. I could have 1,000 different types of chair. And all these chairs are basically patterned after the archetypal chair. The archetype chair is that perfect embodiment of the chair that represents the qualities of that chair, the pattern of that chair. Yes?
So it's really reflecting back to like Plato, Platonic philosophy kind of.
Jung is a little different, but that idea is central here. Okay, this is what these archetypes are. So for Plato, these archetypes were up in the sky somewhere, the perfect thing. Later on, the Aristotelians, then made this into sort of changed it a little bit, and then later on, Christians adopted this thing. Oh, we're all like, we're all images of God. That kind of idea. Same thing. Human beings are the pattern, the copy of God, who's the perfect. So we have to be more like God to try to get back to these archetypes. Plato's idea is you want to get back to these pure forms. Okay? You think of it that way. So for Jung, it's a little different. For Jung, archetypes are unconscious structures that represent energies or principles derived from the collective unconscious. It still can be the same thing. So rather than a chair, I might talk about, I mentioned father. Okay? That we all have some kind of experience or knowledge of fathers. Okay? Or behaviors of fathers, or things related to fathers, or how they look, how they might act, how we act toward them. Okay? And those things come to us from the collective unconscious. And when they come to us, they usually come to us as an image. Okay? And usually this image is in a personified form. Somehow these images become personified. They don't always have to be. But a lot of times they'll come to us in a personified form. Okay? And these can be anything that you really, that could be something that has to do with being a human being. Archetypes could be anything. So it could be fathers, it could be mothers, sisters, brothers. It could be, traveling. It could be, day and night. It could be all sorts of things, right? But these things that we have some experience with this. And so there's two ways of thinking about it. One is sort of the Platonic/Christian way. And by the way, Jung was pretty devout Christian. There's two ways of thinking. One is sort of the spiritual thing, like Plato. They come to us from, some ethereal region, and they come down to us, and they're like that. And Jung writes about this, and he writes about archetypes this way. The other way to think about archetypes, and this way I'm a little more comfortable with, is to think of these things from an evolutionary standpoint. That we as beings, as human beings, are the result of many, 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 many generations, going back literally millions of years, of animals that have evolved on this planet who've had certain experiences. And those experiences, we carry the remembrance of those experiences in our DNA. In other words, we have a certain kind of programming that comes from our heritage as animals evolving on this planet. Does that make sense? So in other words, like you were, millions of years, we evolved to have a relationship with mother, okay? That there's a certain way to relate with the mothers. Mothers are there to provide nourishment. Mothers provide protection. We interact with the mother in a certain way. We don't have to think about how we interact with our mother. We're programmed to interact with our mothers, okay? And we maybe have some elaborate way of doing that as a human being, but you might look at a very low animal, maybe like pick something, a hamster or something. Also has some of that same programming of interacting with its mother. It knows to mammals know to get milk from the mother, right? They have a sucking reflex. All these things, for Jung, that knowledge is residing in the collective unconscious, and we all have that knowledge. It's just very deeply unconscious, and we all share that knowledge. So that experience of mother being the nourishing person when you're a baby, I have that in my collective unconscious. You have that. You have that. You have. We all have the same knowledge there. It's something that is transpersonal, that we all carry with us. Okay, and so therefore, sometimes these patterns come through. Sometimes the archetypes form into patterns, okay? Because they're very similar patterns that we all carry these patterns because somewhere in the past these patterns had some sort of probably survival value, right? Those babies who didn't suckle from their mothers didn't pass on their DNA. We're all a result of animals that suckled from their mother, and that helped them survive, and they passed on their DNA, and here we are. Okay? So if you think of all the millions of things like that, the millions of behavior patterns, the millions of kind of motifs that might be had from our past, that is the collective unconscious. To me, that is a very pervasive argument, because not only can we see it in some DNA patterns, but we can see it in people's behavior. We can see that we have all this stuff in common. And so I don't need to have repressed it from my personal unconscious. Instead, what I've done is I just accessed that information from the collective unconscious. And for Jung, the information comes from that collective unconscious in the form of images, often personified. Okay? And he calls archetypes an entelechy, which is a vital force that directs an organism toward self-fulfillment. This is also a big difference in Freud and Jung. For Freud, the unconscious is a place where stuff gets repressed and gets stuck and causes problems, causes anxiety, and it basically causes pathology. For Jung, the collective unconscious is essentially a source of wisdom. That if you can access it, if you can understand the images coming from it, these can enhance you as a human being. Not necessarily just cure your psychopathology, but enhance you as a human being. Okay? They can simply direct you towards self-fulfillment. And so paying attention to the unconscious, especially the collective unconscious, is something that is essentially, Jung's psychology is one of the first forms of what we now call positive psychology. You guys know what positive psychology is? This is psychology or practice psychology. It's not just about curing pathology, but helping you to become a better person, become happier, more self-fulfilled. And Jung's psychology is really like this. And so this is a very good psychology for people who don't necessarily have pathology, but you just want more fulfillment in life. And so you go to see a Jungian analyst, and you talk about your dreams, and you get in touch with these images, and it helps you become a better, more self-fulfilled person. It's a form of positive psychology. Yes?
So does Freud believe that like a lot of that's repressed is not able to be reacquired, while Jung believes that it can be reacquired?
No, for Freud, stuff gets repressed, and they both believe that, that the project of making the unconscious conscious. So for Freud, you got this repressed stuff that's causing pathology. If you make it conscious, you become aware of it, you can decrease the pathology. For Jung, you can get in touch with the unconscious, especially the deeper layer, the collective unconscious. You can become a better person. You can become better than who you are now. It's almost, in a way, it's almost a spiritual goal, if you will. Okay, and that's a big difference. And you can also deal with the pathology if you're a Jungian. Plenty of Jungians practice and deal with psychopathological issues. Jung himself would practice more like Freud. If somebody had a developmental issue, he would do the Freudian stuff. But Jung also has this idea that this is something that can help you more towards self-fulfillment. And so that's different than Freud. Jung wasn't so much about pathology, but more about just making you into a better person, helping you to achieve your potential. Okay? And you can do that by having access to this collective unconscious. Okay? Collective unconscious. Very, very important difference. Okay? Archetypes are present in all different cultures. You'll find all different cultures have different you'll find lots of cultures have similar stories. Again, we pick on the mother, right? About mothering and myths and stories and motifs about mothering. They'll be common. You'll find some Aborigine down in Tahiti, well, the same sort of myth about motherhood as maybe a Jewish person in upstate New York, and they never talk to each other, but they have the same pattern, right? And some of these patterns are very universal. Some are very obvious. And I'll talk about some of those later on. Okay, at least one. Questions about this? Don't expect to get this in one. You got to let this one percolate for a while. Okay.